Hello, everyone. My name is Milka Popo. On behalf of the Office of Research, I welcome you to this online seminar, a part of the Faculty Information Exchange series. Today's seminar is about communicating impact on your grant proposals, led by Dana McCauley and Elizabeth Shantz from the Research Innovation Office. I will introduce our speakers today. Dana McCauley is the Director of New Venture Creation at the Research Innovation Office. She's an experienced professional communicator who uses marketing tools to enhance the impact and effectiveness of grant applications and other persuasive documents. Elizabeth Shantz is the Knowledge Mobilization Manager at the Research Innovation Office. Previously, she worked as a community-engaged researcher at the Canadian Water Network. She has worked in a number of areas related to knowledge mobilization, including managing a funding program, developing a number of plain language products to share research with end users, and conducting a long-term evaluation of the policy and practice impact of funded research. Thank you, Dana and Elizabeth, for joining us today. I will now pass the mic to Dana.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate those of you who have taken the time to tune in for doing so. Elizabeth and I are going to cover a lot of information in the next, next hour. We will probably have to gallop through, but I want you to know that these slides will be available for you later, and we are recording the webinar, so our voices will also live on in perpetuity and be accessible to you. Plus, we are always available to help you to create, collaborate, commercialize at the Research Innovation Office. These first couple of slides, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, just show you a little bit about what we do. I am the head of the New Venture Creation portfolio, and Elizabeth is the person who makes our knowledge mobilization programs, fantastic. So we're always there to help you, as are our other colleagues. So, to get right into it, how do you communicate your impact? We are going to share some secret ingredients with you. I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler. At the end of this presentation, you're going to know that there are 3 important things to help you, that you can remember, to help you to communicate your impact more effectively. So I'd like everyone to just take a moment. We don't have a lot of time, but if you can take a moment and just imagine you're talking to this little girl, and in the comments section, jot down what you do. What is your research? It doesn't have to be a description of everything you do. Maybe choose one program that you're very focused on right now. The reason I'm asking you to put it in the comment section is I'm hoping that there'll be opportunities for me to use your work as examples as we go through. We may not have time for that, but if we do, it might make all of this a little bit more meaningful for you as we move forward. So while you do that, I'm going to continue with the presentation. This is a slide that doesn't flow as nicely as I'd like it to, but I've worked hard on it. And what I want you to realize is that the way you generally are trained to communicate your research is to give a lot of information up front and then, come back at the very end to the value and the impact that you hope you're going to have. And this is fine for an academic paper, but it isn't going to help you to communicate to your stakeholders like community partners and potential industry partners. It will not help you to get the gatekeepers who get the first round of grant applications or pass the opinions editor at the Globe and Mail. You're very right to use these techniques, and you are applying to logic and to establishing your credibility. But Elizabeth and I are going to assert that instead you want to turn that pyramid upside down when you're doing communications about your impact and really engage people on an emotional level. And that usually comes from understanding why. Why should I be doing this work? And why should you care is even more important. This is about your reader. It's not about you as much. Of course, without you, there is no impact, but you really want to engage them. So in the marketing world, this is called your value proposition, and it's the promise benefit that's delivered by a product, and it's the reason it exists. So many of you, even if you don't have an iPhone, you will be familiar with them. And it's important to think about the stuff around you and think about why do I buy this? Why don't I buy the other product? And Apple, they position their iPhone as being built on the belief that it's much more than a collection of features, that it's nice to use, it creates a magical experience. Whether they actually achieve that, that's another topic. But that gives you a sense of what a value proposition is for a consumer product. For researchers, it's similar, but of course, not as simple. So for you each as subject matter experts, people who are doing important work and want to have acknowledgement and attract all the right types of students, partners, and offers for publication, it's a clear statement that explains how your work advances science or a subject matter in the humanities. And it helps you to really connect with people. So you're going to have a value proposition for you and your overall career and your work, but then you also, for each project, will want to have a value proposition as well. And again, back to reiterate what I said a couple of slides ago, why should people care about your work, and what gains are you going to achieve by doing this project? If you can articulate that, you are going to really get a lot of attention and really engage with people on levels that are beyond that intellectual piece. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now. I'll come back in a few slides to share one piece of info. Then Elizabeth will pop back in and do a bit more on knowledge mobilization. And then if time permits, we're going to use the tools I just introduced to you and create a value proposition for a grant application.
Thank you, Dana. So this idea that Dana just mentioned, understanding why you're doing your research, is one of the really central components of what we call knowledge mobilization. So you might have heard a number of other terms used for this process: knowledge transfer, knowledge translation, KTT, knowledge exchange. The choice of what word you use varies essentially based on what sector you're in or where in the world you're in, or where in the world you are, but they largely describe the same process of moving research into action, and I'm going to use them in the same way today. So there are a variety of definitions of knowledge mobilization. As I said, essentially it's all about moving knowledge to action. Activities that fall under this umbrella of knowledge mobilization can include exchange of knowledge between researchers and stakeholders. It can include synthesis across disciplines. It can include translation into plain language, as well as dissemination through appropriate channels to improve the application and the uptake of that knowledge to affect some kind of change. One other term you're going to hear me using today is the term end user or stakeholder, and I use that term just to mean the people who could use the research that you're producing. They could be in the community, in government, or in industry. There's often a lot of discussion about the difference between knowledge mobilization and communications as well. There can be significant overlap between these types of activities, but essentially communications activities tend to be targeted at raising awareness and attention, whereas knowledge mobilization tends to be focusing on converting that awareness and attention into concrete change in behavior, practice, or policy. So I want to take a minute here to tell a knowledge mobilization story before I go on. So this is about a man who's in a hot air balloon, and he gets lost, and he descends to the ground to ask for directions, and he sees a woman, and he says, "Excuse me, where am I?" And the woman shouts back, "You are at 45 degrees, 25 minutes, 29 seconds north, and 75 degrees, 42 minutes, 20 seconds west. I'm about 100 meters above sea level, so you must be about 120 meters. The man says, you must be a scientist. I ask you a simple question, you give me too much information, and I'm still lost. And the woman says, you must be a policymaker. You come out of nowhere with your questions. I give you the most accurate and precise answer I can. You're still lost, and you blame me. So, funny little story that illustrates this real world challenge. There's a significant gap between science and the people who can use it. So, how do we breach that gap? There's been some research on what that gap actually looks like, particularly in the medical field is where most of this research comes from. How many years, type into the chat box, how many years do you think it takes for evidence to reach clinicians and practice? Just give me your best guess there. 5 years, 5 to 8, yeah, 15. Great guesses, everybody. So through it actually has been shown to take on average about 17 years for evidence to reach clinicians and be put into practice. Any guesses on how long it takes to reach the general public, for the general public to hear about that? Definitely too long. 20 years, that's a great guess. 30. Yep, it's 30 on average, this study found. So it takes a long time for people to hear about research. And another statistic that I found just shocking is what percentage of Americans do you think are receiving the best recommended care according to the current science, given those numbers? Around 50% of Americans are receiving the best recommended care, but 20 to 25% of the care that's provided is either unneeded or can be actively harmful to patients. So there is obviously an enormous gap between what we know and what we're doing. And we need to breach that gap, and we need to understand why that gap exists. There's a whole bunch of research, a whole bunch of reasons that make it really difficult, both for researchers to do knowledge mobilization, and also reasons that make it difficult for research users to learn about and use knowledge. And I'm going to focus on that latter right now, because I'm sure you all know about the difficulties that researchers face in doing knowledge mobilization. It's difficult for research users to learn about research. They often can't access journal articles because they're behind paywalls. They might not hear about new research that's come out. So to help with this challenge, you might consider making your research open access, or at least making a summary of it open access, or sharing it with end users through a mechanism that they already use, so that they don't have to go looking for it. They might not be perusing journals. Put that information where they are so that they can hear about it. End users might not have time to read research. There's a lot of articles that come out every day, and people just don't have time to keep up with that. They have a full-time job. Consider providing a short, concise summary of your research that people can read and assess whether or not it's something they want to learn more about. End users often don't use the same technical language that we do in academia, which makes it very difficult for them to understand what we're talking about when we share our research with them. So it's important to use plain language and avoid jargon to make sure that your message is coming across clearly. And finally, sometimes it can be difficult for end users to see the relevance of the research that we're doing to their daily lives. So it's really important to go back and focus on how that research is relevant to them, to their challenges, to the issues they're facing. What does knowledge mobilization actually look like? When we talk about knowledge mobilization, often the first thing our mind jumps to is what we call end of grant knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization. So this is where you complete a research project, mostly in isolation in the lab, in the field, and then you have your results and you want to share them with with your end users after the research is complete. So this can sometimes be very effective, but it's widely accepted that the gold standard for knowledge mobilization is something that we call integrated knowledge mobilization or co-production of knowledge. So this is when end users are integrated throughout the course of a research project. So what does this actually look like in practice? You might involve your target end users by asking them for input into the research question that you're asking. Involve them in regular updates about your research, let them know where you're at, or perhaps they can even participate in the research itself. They can always provide input into the best way to share results with themselves, with their colleagues. This way of doing research can be more time consuming, but largely the more end users are involved in the research process throughout the research process, the more impact we tend to see. If you're interested in learning more about how you can involve end users at each of these stages, shoot me an email anytime, and I'm happy to brainstorm how this might work for your particular projects. So how do you develop a good knowledge mobilization plan? There are 5 basic questions that we tend to need to answer to develop this plan. So the first question is, who is your audience? It's really, really important to identify your audience as clearly and specifically as you possibly can. So don't just say that you're trying to reach the general public, but specify perhaps which segments of the general public. You're not just trying to reach industry. Which members of industry are you trying to reach? It's important that we don't try and make a product to share information with everyone. Different audiences are going to want to know different types of information. They're going to want it presented in different ways, and they're going to use it for different purposes. So if you have multiple audiences in mind that you'd like to share your information with, it's always good to think about different mechanisms to share information with those different audiences. The second question we like to think about is why. So reflect on why your audience is going to care about your research. What are the challenges they are facing that your work could help with? What questions are they struggling with? What is the context they're working in? This is where having a team member or advisor from your target group can be really helpful, because they can advise you on what the answers to these questions are, and it's a really key part of understanding your value proposition.
Thank you. So this is a chart that comes from something called the Lean Startup Canvas, and it can be applied to researchers. And so I took a stab at doing that. So you're not developing a product that gets wrapped up in a bow, but you are developing communication pieces that we call knowledge mobilization products. And if you think about what do the people who are going to be using your information, what do they have to gain? What are their problems right now? How do they feel about those problems? And what can we do to help them to move forward? It really to list those things, and then to list how does your research, if it's a grant application, hope to create those gains. You may not know, and generally I would think you wouldn't know what exactly will go in that box after your research, but what are you trying to do, and how will that relieve pain? What is what's the problem that could go away? And I saw, there's some really interesting projects going on campus that were shared in the comments section, and I can see that there'd be some very obvious benefits to some of your work that you could probably quite easily list. But then it's also good to think about, why are you the person or the group or the lab or the center that is best suited to deliver that pain relief to your end user? And if you can prove that in a grant application or in any kind of a brief that is going out to a potential partner, you'll establish that fit between what you're doing and what they need, and dollars will flow from granting bodies, as well as partnerships being formed, because you'll be speaking to what they want to accomplish. It's very common. And I see David Hobson has joined us, which is great, because he and I administer the Griffin Slayer, gap funding, the Barrett grants, as well as the Food for Thought commercialization grants. And quite often, the applications that he and I review show us that the applicant has kind of cut and pasted stuff from another application, and they've never thought about what we're trying to accomplish with those grants and what we have to report on. So we can't even consider them. So this is a really important concept for you, and I would say particularly important for you to share with the grad students on your team who maybe are doing the legwork on the grant applications and getting them ready. If you don't want to have to do a lot of rewriting, having them understand this paradigm will be really helpful.
Thank you, Dana. So that, as Dana said, that question of understanding why is central to all of this, and it's something that we often tend to make assumptions about. But it's important to actually proof these ideas with members of your audience if you can, or seek out information that validates your assumptions about why members of your audience would actually be interested in the information you want to share. So, what information do you actually want to share? What do people really need to know? The first thing to think about is essential information. Often there's a lot of information that we may be able to take out depending on which audience we're trying to share with. We might be able to take out a lot of our methods information. We might be able to take out a good amount of our detailed results information to get to the meat of what we actually want them to take home and to focus on recommendations or actionable items that people can apply. You can always pair a longer appendix or a longer document with a shorter document if this is information that you think is still important, but maybe shouldn't be the focus of the executive summary or other pieces. Design is an incredibly important and often overlooked element of messaging. Don't just write in blocks of text. Use lots and lots of white space. If you're creating a written product, use lists, use question and answers, use images. Do whatever you can to make the product you're creating visually appealing, easy to scan, and easy for people to look at and assess whether or not they can find the information that they need in this product. If you're presenting them with a block of text, the likelihood is they're not going to actually take the time to read it. They're going to take one look, do a brief scan of the first paragraph, perhaps, decide, this isn't really relevant to me, and move on to the next thing. If possible, it's always good to involve somebody with expertise in design to either help you create products or at least provide feedback on the products that you're trying to create. We run a Skills for Research Impact workshop series through Research Innovation Office in partnership with the Alliance and the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. We have sessions dedicated to plain language, to graphic design, and to other elements of this. So if you or your grad students are interested in learning more about these topics, I encourage you to check out those offerings. Plain language is another crucial element of what information that we share, choosing the right language to share the information that we want. So plain language is not just about dumbing down the idea that you're trying to share, which is something that I often hear when I'm working with people to write in plain language. Plain language is actually just about choosing language that's appropriate for the audience and easy to understand. So what I'm going to do now is take a few moments to share a couple of rules of plain language that you can take and apply in your writing. And I'm always happy to workshop documents with you if you'd like an extra eye on them. So jargon. In academia, we're often taught to use jargon, and jargon is just language that's specific to our field that has specific technical meanings. This jargon can be a good thing. It lets you communicate faster with your colleagues because they share an understanding of what those words mean. But it can often be a significant barrier to understanding for other audiences who are not familiar with that jargon. So as much as you can, try and avoid jargon. One tip I often suggest to people is check the grade level of what you're writing. Microsoft Word has a neat little tool that lets you check what the grade level is. So consumers often access articles that are written between a grade 7 and 10 reading level. I've done some fun tests with some of the academic articles that either academic pieces that I've produced or that others have produced, and they've varied from grade 17 to grade 23. So it can be just a really neat little way to look at the complexity of the products that you're creating. Another interesting thing to think about is the meaning of words. So lots of words have different meanings for scientists than they do the public. So just the first example, you can read through the chart, but the word theory to the public, theory means a guess or a hunch, and that's very different from how we use it in the academic setting, which is a generally accepted understanding. So even these basic words that we use often without thinking can have very different meanings depending on the audience. So take every word you write and consider how it might be misinterpreted or how you could reduce that jargon. Acronyms are another thing that we overuse a lot in academia. try and figure out how you can reduce your use of acronyms. So what are some words that you can use instead? Generally, I advise against just explaining your acronyms and using them anyways. It makes it much more difficult for non-specialists to follow, especially if you have more than one acronym in your document. People are going to constantly be going back and forth, checking what that means if they're not familiar with it. So avoid acronyms as much as possible. Words and phrases. Don't choose a complex word where a simpler word will do. And this isn't necessarily about jargon or the more technical terminology that you might use, but rather about choosing the simplest possible words to make up your sentence. It's also about using the least amount of words possible. So don't use a phrase when you could just use one word instead. Instead of saying utilize, say use. Instead of saying has the capacity to, you can just say can. We are often very guilty of using these words that plump up our writing, but it makes it much easier for audiences to follow if we can avoid them entirely. Finally, focus on the implications. It's not enough just to choose the right language when you're sharing your research, but you really have to contextualize what you're sharing. So go back to the audience or the audiences that you identified and understand what that information really means for them. How does it fit into the context of what they already know or what they already practice? How does it affect the things that they're currently concerned about? How does it relate to current policy or regulations? Does it suggest that those might need to be changed? And this, focusing on the implications, is something that you'll practice in the value proposition exercise that Dana is going to do later on. So fourth question is about format, choosing a format that you're going to use to share information with your audience. So again, I keep repeating the same thing, but to decide this, go back to who your audience is. Think about where they go to access information. What are the newsletters, the websites, the podcasts, or the other places that they use regularly to access information? Generally, instead of creating your own website, you might want to consider using these mechanisms that are already in place. It can take a lot of effort and time to drive traffic to a new place. So consider whether or not that's something that you want to do if you want to create a website or create an app, for example, and think about how you're going to get that information to your audience about the new mechanism that you've created. Also consider what might make it difficult for them to access information. So is bandwidth an issue? For some rural communities, they might not be able to watch a webinar should you put it on because they just don't have the bandwidth to watch it. Is travel an issue? Travel is obviously an issue for all of us right now, but as you go on in the future and plan events, is the cost, is travel, is that going to limit participation in events that you're hoping to hold? Also think about who your audience listens to and who's a credible messenger to them. And for certain audiences, it's not always going to be you as the academic expert. If you're presenting to a different audience, say you're presenting to a group of farmers, would it help for you to co-present with another farmer who has implemented the change that you're suggesting and can actually speak to what that might look like on their farm or in their operation? So who's a credible messenger? And it might not always be you. How can you leverage the trust they might have in other messengers? Depending on your audience, you might need to consider timelines. If you're trying to reach a political audience, you might need to consider things like elections. If you're lobbying for something to be included in the budget, consider when that budget comes out and when decisions start to be made. If you're trying to get something in the federal budget, which comes out in March, you want to start activities in September or October to draw attention to that issue. Finally, consider whether or not you have the time and the resources to do the work that you're hoping to do. Apps are a great example. Everyone wants to do an app, but they take a lot of time and a lot of resources to produce. So is that the best mechanism that you can choose? So the next slide shows you just a smattering of a few options that you might be able to choose from. There's so many different things you can do. You really have to go back to your audience and figure out what's best for them. Another thing that I often suggest is layering a few different mechanisms. If you're developing a report, perhaps you might also consider doing an infographic, a video, and or a policy brief alongside that report so that different audiences can access the mechanism that works best for them. The final question when developing a knowledge mobilization plan is about thinking about the effect you want your intervention to have, or you want the information you're sharing to have, and how you might measure that. And I'm not going to explore this in detail today, but again, we offer a workshop on evaluation, and I'm always happy to sit down one-on-one and talk about how you might evaluate the impact of your project if that's something you're interested in. And finally, before I pass it off to Dana, I just wanted to go back and think about developing a knowledge mobilization plan as part of a grant application. What are some of the common weaknesses that we see that might limit the willingness of funding bodies to provide funding? First, you may not have clearly narrowed in on your audience enough. Or you might not have involved your end users, your audience in a meaningful way, or shown that they actually want the product or knowledge that you're trying to share. And those second and third items are the most common criticisms that we see of grant applications. You might not have selected a method that makes sense for your audience. Perhaps you should have, perhaps you can consult with them in advance to make sure that it makes sense and include that information in your grant application that you've had those consultations. Evaluation. Many projects do not have a strong strategy to evaluate uptake and impact. So if this is something that the granting agency that you are applying to for funding requires, it's a very, very easy area for your application to shine as if you have a strong evaluation plan. So I can help review your grant applications if that's something that you're interested in. There's other groups on campus. If you're in CSAW's, CESI also offers grant application assistance. So if that's something that's of interest to you, contact our office early. There's limited amounts of things we can do if you're contacting us the day before. But if you'd like to just sound out an idea a couple of weeks in advance, I know those timelines are difficult because we're often working at the last minute, but we can really help you with a strong knowledge mobilization plan if you contact us in advance. Back to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I was actually just typing in the comments, FYI, contact her in advance, and then you said it. So, that's one of the reasons that taking a workshop like this is helpful, because we think that by doing some exercises that you'll need support less and that you'll internalize ability to do way more with what you already have without needing us. But that said, I really do hope that we will see all of you and that you'll tell two friends and so on, because we love having great stories to tell. So please do come to see us. So Elizabeth's gone through in the last slide all the weaknesses that could be in your overall grant application or your research plan, which is really what a grant application is. I'm going to take a few minutes just to do a couple of really quick exercises with you so that you can see how to get past the gatekeeper. And this could be, as I said, anything from a grant application to a query to write an article for a journal like Nature or whatever the primary journal is in your area of academia. Before you write your value proposition down, you should test out what you think your value proposition is. And this is a quick, very easy, flexible little tool that you can use. A friend of mine, Seema Gandhi, who teaches our Innovation Toolkit Advantage workshop, she uses this tool as a quick test for when she's helping companies to create new products. In the case of Uber, you can obviously read the information there. What the value proposition test does is it allows you to see where your consumers of your information are right now. So that goes back to, if you remember the diagram I showed you, what do they want to accomplish? And so usually that means that they're in a particular point of need. So what are the problems they have is another way to say that. And then after your work, what will they have? And if there's an improvement, that's great. There's probably value there. But then the real icing on the cake is, how do they feel right now? Do they feel frustrated? Do they feel uninformed? Is there a negative emotion that is pervasive, not necessarily with the person who is reading your application, but with the group that they're serving? And how will they feel after your work? And if you can encapsulate that, actual value with an emotional response, in marketing we call these activating emotions, you will be very familiar with them if you take a moment and think about all the articles you've read this week when you went into the news platforms that you frequent. Headlines are designed to activate your emotions. Here's another one that is a little bit of a complex type of a product. I know that it's very simple, and as Elizabeth said, I don't want anyone to leave here saying, oh, the Research Innovation Office wants us to be superficial. No, we don't want you to be superficial. Back to that pyramid. We want you to start with a clear, easily understood value proposition at the top of whatever it is you are writing or saying in your communications, and then start to go deeper and deeper. You will lose audience as you go down, but that's okay, because generally speaking, that is how life works. The general public is a wide audience. And then when you get down to other people, like your peers, who you want to collaborate with on future projects, they will keep reading and go into those supplementary items that Elizabeth talked about. David, who I mentioned a couple of minutes earlier, he and I do a lot of work with Robert Hanner, and we recently had a call with him, and he explained some research he's working on. And this is how it's described to people who aren't his colleagues. David and I, of course, are not DNA scientists, but this is the way he described it to us. And then I'm going to show you how I changed the way it's described to and tested this as a value proposition, and you'll see how you can use these tools. So Bob Hanner wants funding and partners who can enable his team to develop molecular diagnostic tools to create biosurveillance systems that utilize nanotechnology and DNA barcoding science. If successful, these specialized systems will be used by municipalities to test effluent streams to predict when COVID-19 breakouts may occur. So that doesn't sound super complicated. I'm sure that he could really add a lot of jargon if he were talking to someone else who is his peer in this kind of work. And for some publications, for instance, like a journal, that may be as simple as his value proposition needs to be. But I would say that if he is putting that into the very first paragraph of a grant application, or if that's the way he talks to the clerk at City Hall when he's trying to make an appointment to talk to the operations engineer for the city, that he's probably losing them. So for Bob's idea, this COVID-19 project, what do municipalities have right now? And this is very relatable. They have no way to make contingency plans. They have sleepless nights. If you've been watching the premier of the province come on TV on a regular basis and say something's going to happen, but we don't know when and we don't know how, you know exactly how these people are looking and feeling. They're very worried about doing the wrong thing. They're worried about criticism. And if something like Bob's strategy could work, he's going to give these types of people, the people who run towns and provinces, actual trigger points where they can put systems into place. And that's going to give them confidence. It's going to make all of us as citizens feel better, and it's going to create alignment. So these are the types of words and the types of things I would advise Bob if he were actually writing a grant application right now, or drafting a letter to get in and talk to the mayor, the premier, or an MP, Navdeep Bains, whomever he needed to get on side. So we've tested his value proposition, but how does he communicate it? You're not going to send that goofy grid around to people. That's not going to, nobody is going to read that. Again, this is going to look so simple, and you may feel insulted, but please don't. take this as a tool that helps you to get going and to start and gives you that very top point on our pyramid. You want to write a value proposition statement that addresses a community who cares about a problem. They tells them what service your research will or may deliver and how you'll deliver it. In some cases, you may be able to work in why you should be the one to deliver it. That isn't always the case. That it probably will come later in maybe the next sentence or two. And the reason we're doing this, just as a little reminder, is that you might be saying apples and be so clear in your mind that you're saying apples, but are the people who are reading those summaries and deciding which ones go into the review pile and which ones go into the reject pile, are they hearing oranges? It's super important to use this accessible language to get through to the next level. So what I'm going to show you is short, it's specific, and the idea behind it is it makes somebody say, tell me more. So it's not complete, it's just the hook. So here's the template. I gave a little example here of somebody who might be working with athletes. And so of course it's just a click in, the 4 is for elite athletes and what's their problem. They struggle with jet lag, which impacts their performance. So, and here's where I put in the why this person should be the one to be considered. It's an internationally recognized team who will research the bioavailability of melatonin supplements and provide travel recovery solutions, that's the pain reliever, that will help travel-weary athletes to win more international competitions. So all of a sudden, anybody who is planning and investing in Canadian athletes sees this at the top of the description of what the grant application is going to do, and they're like, my bosses will like that. We want more gold medals. We want a bigger return on the investment we put into athletes. So here's the template for you. If we had more time today, I would say let's choose one to do together. Instead, I went ahead and I did one for Bob's research. So for city councils who need to protect not just citizens, but the local economy, our diagnostic tools, so see, it's not a biosurveillance system that utilizes nanotechnology and DNA barcoding science anymore. It's a diagnostic tool, will easily and effectively monitor COVID-19 exposure levels so that municipal governments can accurately predict outbreaks and implement preventative closures and create mitigation strategies when and where they're needed most. So I said the same exact thing when we started out this exercise, just with a lot more $50 words, as my son would call them, and without it really being about a specific user group. You may need to do this value proposition type of exercise several times for the same project because you may have multiple stakeholders. So this time I wrote it to get past the gatekeepers at City Council who may want to, go and do a test, collaborate with Bob and his team to see if his theory plays out and actually can become a tool for them. If it was for, getting an industry partner, it might be a little bit different. It might be for companies who, want to find new revenue streams in the COVID-19 space, blah, 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 blah. So all that to say that you may, to Elizabeth's point, as you develop those layered communication pieces, need to do slightly different versions of your value proposition. In marketing, we would call that for your market segments, but it's a great way to just make sure that you have something really solid that you're working on that somebody cares about. And, I know that scientists and academics in the humanities and social sciences, that they often go very, very deep, and that there's value in that type of unbridled scholarship. But that is not generally what gets funded. What gets funded is generally something that will as our tagline at the university says, improve life. So this will help you to, if you've got 3 or 4 ways of approaching a scholarly endeavor that really speaks to you and that you know needs to happen, this helps you to frame what you're doing and make choices about your project that advance your subject, but also get you the partners and the uptake that you need to feel relevant and to feel and rightfully say that you've made a big contribution to your area. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know that was extremely fast and not as relevant to each of you as I'd like it to be. In another setting, we'd each have done our own and shared them. I'm wildly open to having you contact me later. We could set up a half an hour and do these exercises with your work over the phone. That would be my pleasure. And if you are working on this type of communication at any time in the future and want my help, please reach out. Other researchers have, and I can tell you that I know of at least one where he ended up getting his grant because of, I think, some of the work that he and I did recently. So I'm here and always willing to chat with you. Now I'm going to give it back to Elizabeth, and hopefully you can pop questions into the comments as well. And if we have a few minutes, we'll address them. Otherwise, we'll do some follow-ups with you later. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dana. So I was going to run through an example with these 5 questions and just give you something concrete and practical to think about how it might work. But I want to be conscious that we've only got 10 minutes left. Can people, those that I can see, nod their heads? Would it be helpful for me to go through a concrete example, or would you rather do some questions? So nod your head for concrete example. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to run through a concrete example really quickly then and leave a little bit of time for questions. So if we take Bob Hanner, I think Dana already identified City Council is probably the decision maker here. They're going to have to decide whether or not they want to shell out the money for this product. The secondary audience there might be the technical experts who provide them with advice. So you might want to think about layering products for both of those audiences. Why do they care? Dana was already very clear with the value proposition there, but why they care. What information might you share with these audiences? Well, if we focus on City Council as our primary decision makers here, what might you want to include? So you probably want to reiterate the issue. You probably want to talk about how the technology could provide a solution. You probably want to give a little bit on how the technology works, but I wouldn't go into much detail on that. What else might they want to know? They might want to know how accurate the test is. They might want to know what the cost of the test is, how long it takes for results to be provided. So just try and get into their minds and think about what are they going to need to know to make the decision. Provide it to them right up front. What might they not need to know? What could you take out? Again, the science behind how it actually works is probably not something that the top level decision makers need to know. That's something that can go in an appendix for the technical staff who are going to be accelerating this recommendation up to council. Mechanism, how are you going to share this information? For me, what I would probably do, municipalities is a very large and disparate group. I would probably try and find a group with central links to municipalities across Canada. Federation of Canadian Municipalities is the one that comes to mind. And I would probably go and consult with them about what would be the most effective way to share this technology with their municipalities, try and get buy-in from a member of staff of that organization. What mechanism do you use? Well, maybe a short video demonstrating use of the technology would be appropriate. You can pair that with a visually attractive one-page summary about the technology that could go to all the members of City Council and could even be used more widely to share information about the technology. And then you could pair that with a more technical report for the technical staff who need to know. For what effect? What is your desired impact? Well, we all know what the impact is to reduce outbreaks of coronavirus. With all the public data available, perhaps this is a situation where you could actually look at impact. You could assess which municipalities have implemented the technology, gather data comparing rates of transmission between municipalities who had used the technology and those who hadn't, and see if you could show any concrete differences there. So these 5 questions can be broken down into many more detailed pieces, but like I said, they're a great way to think through the basics of a knowledge mobilization plan. And if you'd like to get into more detail, please do contact us at our office. Contact me, and I'd be happy to workshop through something with you. Dana, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, so I promised you 3 secret ingredients. I bet you can think of a couple of them. Interestingly, when I do this type of value proposition workshop, I can tell you that no one has ever identified the one that I think is the most important, and I am always surprised by that because it is empathy. It's all about understanding what someone else needs. It's not about, empathy is different from sympathy, so remember that. And as long as you're being empathetic to your user group, to the community at large, you're going to have really impactful ideas and impactful projects to share. Then, of course, clarity and simplicity. And that doesn't mean that it's stupid or facile or any of those things that are the negative connotations of simplicity, but it just means that people can really grasp it very, very quickly. And then they can share it as well. They'll internalize the information. So those are your 3 secret ingredients. And we have a bit of time for questions. Just going to point out that in the appendix, you'll have lots of information you can read about the Research Innovation Office, because I'm sure you care about everything that we do. There's a great guide to research partnerships that you can download from our website. It's designed for your potential partners, but you having a copy of it and understanding, how we can work with you, with your partners might be very useful. And as well, we've got a resource section at the end here where there's lots of great elements of data that we've shared about other programs and some templates, as well as information about our upcoming Advantage workshops. So thank you very much. I see some nice comments here. Thank you very much, but I don't see any questions off the top. Please, I think we have 3 minutes. So if someone has a fairly short question, please share it. Otherwise, I will send this back to Milka for her wrap up.
This was great. Thank you, Dana and Elizabeth. I think you're getting nice comments here. I just wanted to remind everyone that these slides will be posted on the Office of Research website within the Faculty Information Exchange Series page. So I think this will conclude the official part of the session. I don't see any more questions, but you will see I provided a link to the evaluation survey. If you would be kind enough to fill it out, we value your feedback. So with that, I want to thank you again. I don't know if you can clap online, but this was very useful. I enjoyed the presentation myself too. Thank you.